Paul Lewandowski, U.S. Army veteran and YouTube host, is joining me now in the studio. Hi, Paul. It's a pleasure to hear you and to see you again in our studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nataliia.
So, Paul, they say that, history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. And what we're seeing around peace talks right now on Ukraine, it feels like the second. And we already had the Minsk Agreements with Russian occupiers before. It led nowhere, and Russia did not return a single piece of land back then. And now, for some reason, President Zelensky is again being pushed towards a deal. He, as the leader of a sovereign country, will not accept, at least what we hear from him. So what are these talks really aiming for, the one that's going to happen soon on Friday? And what is behind the Trump administration's rush and that visits to Moscow recently?
Well, I think it's unfortunately another failure of sort of policy making by the Trump administration. We've talked a lot about the fact that the administration doesn't really seem to be able to handle fixed policy positions. And as we pointed out, literally just a few days ago, the policy position of the administration was Putin needs to meet with Zelensky in exchange for a meeting with Trump. Well, that condition got thrown out the window by what appears to be a change in the president's mood. So it's unclear if there is an objective, what that objective is, but what at least one outlet, I think it was the German newspaper Bild, was reporting, was that the entire premise of this meeting between Trump and Putin was based on a misunderstanding, or what the administration believes is a misunderstanding of Putin's willingness to accept certain conditions. Namely, the Trump envoy Steve Witkoff reportedly believed Putin was offering to withdraw from contested territories when, in fact, that simply wasn't the case.
Absolutely, because when I read or speak with the guys on the front line with Ukrainian soldiers, and my colleagues who are war correspondents, they are saying, Natalie, this is horrible. Everything is very intensifying, especially near Donetsk region. Zaporizhia is, the Russia is moving a more weapon towards that region, at least for the last 24 hours. So I don't know. Do you think that the American president allow himself to be fooled by Russian dictator again?
I 100% believe he can be fooled by Putin. It doesn't seem to take a lot to fool this president. Again, we've seen, unfortunately, an increasingly unhinged behavior from him. If you read some of his recent tweets, in some cases, the tweet begins with one message and doesn't even really reach like a concluding thought. There's been a number of bizarre interviews that he's conducted. So, and that's on top of, as we've talked about, a sort of chaotic mood-based policymaking, where he'll, again, say that he's tired of talking with Putin. Just, again, 2 weeks ago, that was his stance. So I'm tired of talking. I need to see action. Now it's okay to talk. He's happy to talk, and he's actually happy to bring Putin to the United States. In fact, he's going to go leave the White House and fly to Putin and meet him in Alaska. So, again, the ability of the U.S. president to not have a fixed policy makes understanding him or predicting outcomes almost impossible.
Yeah, but do you think that, because lots of European leaders now saying, one by one, saying that this meeting on Friday should happen with the Ukrainian president next to them as well, because nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So my question to you, is that even an option?
Of course, it's an option. I strongly suspect that Putin would withdraw from a meeting that Zelensky was attending. He's done exactly that with every other U.S.-backed meeting, negotiation in Istanbul, right? Zelensky attended. The Russian, Vladimir Putin did not. So I don't see any reason that Putin would bite on that. I think it's probably the Europeans trying to make the best of a bizarre situation. Again, the Russian dictator being hosted by the U.S. president. And I think maybe their hope is that by staking out this sort of lower stake stance of, okay, well, you can have your meeting, but you should at least invite Zelensky. Maybe they hope that, again, Putin will withdraw and Trump will get angry once again and perhaps return to the policy as of 2 weeks ago, which was more supportive of Ukraine.
What other topics Russian dictator and American president could potentially discuss rather than just Ukraine?
Trump seems very hung up on what he perceives to be good deals or trade deals. He's always open to some level of economic deal making. And so I assume that will almost certainly be part of the conversation that at least Putin has with him. In terms of other interest areas, I'm sure there is going to be some level of discussion about the conflict in Israel. That's also pretty significant to the administration. But again, it's unclear how much leverage Putin has to bear on that conflict. But again, because he's shown that he's willing to sort of lie and promise things he can't deliver on, and the administration has shown a willingness to sort of believe him in spite of all the evidence. Again, it's hard to say what could even come up from this. I mean, literally, these are not how international leader-on-leader meetings are conducted in almost any other country. In any other country, this would be extremely staged, managed, a very fixed agenda. Diplomats, all the way from low-level contacts, all the way up to ministers of state, secretary of state, would all have had extensive conversations prior to this meeting. The fact that none of that has happened is sort of unprecedented. I think, truthfully, the most likely outcome is that Putin is going to use this as an event to embarrass and humiliate President Trump, probably get in front of cameras and lecturing him on how Alaska actually belongs to Russia or something to that effect.
But American president, he has such an intelligent team, I guess. I mean, why they cannot predict that? Well, yeah, of course. I remember the moment at the Oval Cabinet with the Ukrainian president. He was humiliated, for sure. And I understand that Ukrainian team could not predict that he will be attacked. But in what way Russian dictator will humiliate American president?
Sure. So I think, again, the number one, so some of it has already happened by simply the venue of this meeting. And the analogy that I often use is in a company, in a work setting, right? If the president of a company goes to a low-level employee like an intern and says, intern, you're going to meet with me right now in my office. The intern is never going to say, hey, I need to finish this spreadsheet first, right? That's not how that works. The president gets to dictate terms, the more powerful person in an interaction. And in the case of two countries, the more powerful person gets to dictate terms and conditions. And so simply by the fact that the White House's stance went from Putin will meet with Zelensky to get this meeting to Putin saying, no, I'm not going to meet with Zelensky, that signals to the international community, hey, Putin is the more powerful figure here. He's closer to the boss. And we've also seen already Putin, for example, presenting the Order of Lenin, a Russian military award, to Steve Witkoff to pass along to actually a high-level U.S. intelligence official whose son was killed fighting in Russia. The son seems to have fallen into some sort of pro-Russian ideological extremist camp. But the idea, of course, is to sort of embarrass the U.S. to say, look, your own citizens are out here fighting on behalf of Russia. So this seems to be Putin's MO for these kind of interactions. And the more he can do it, the more even he can force the president, for example, he forced the U.S. president to leave the White House and meet him in Alaska, which is itself pretty embarrassing for, again, the U.S. president, the leader of the free world, the largest military and economy on earth, and he can't get the Russian president to meet him in D.C. That alone is pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, I hope that the American president is playing this, I don't know, dirty game of Putin just to reach to some point, in favor of Ukraine. Paul, yesterday I opened CNN, and what I see that the U.S. ambassador to NATO, I guess, Matthew Whitaker, he said in response to President Zelensky that no big chunks or sections are going to be given that haven't been fought for or earned on the battlefield, referring to Ukraine's territorial concessions. This is not about calling it aggression, an attack on a peaceful country, or breaking international law, but about saying Russia gained this land by fighting, which is complete nonsense, but he is saying that. Why are we hearing this kind of language rhetoric now?
Sure. So what I think is the more generous policy interpretation. I mean, one, again, it's worth noting that in this administration, the president's the sole originator of policy. And so whatever he says that day is going to happen, the rest of the administration gets in line, right? We've seen people who sort of push back or take a different stance end up fired pretty quickly. So it's a little bit of the only people left are people who are going to agree with him. But I think what you're also seeing perhaps from the more sophisticated diplomatic corps of the U.S. is that they may believe, if there's hope for a negotiated settlement, that they have to appear to be closer to a neutral broker than to having one side or another. Again, I think the U.S. has sort of tried this and it hasn't worked, but that I think when you see smarter diplomats say that sort of stuff, I believe that's the angle they're trying to take.
Yeah, I was reading some Wall Street Journal, I guess, and they were saying one of the ideas Putin and Trump will meet is like for the United States is to reset relationship with Putin. So it's not about Ukraine, which is not very optimistic. And, Russian commentators also say that the summit will not only be about Ukraine, but about the higher responsibility of two nuclear powers. And they're saying about something like bright future of U.S.-Russia cooperation.
Yeah, the U.S. has just a very robust track record of believing that these resets are possible. George W. Bush famously hosted Putin at his ranch in Texas, where they talked, and he felt that he had achieved a strategic reset with Putin. Of course, Putin responded to that strategic reset by invading Georgia in 2008. So then the Obama administration came in and said, no, we're going to do a strategic reset. And that, of course, resulted in Putin annexing the Donbass and Crimea. And so and of course, President Trump came in after Obama, believing, again, in a strategic reset. And that probably was when Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine. The only person who hadn't sort of tried to do this reset and treat Putin like a neighbor who you just have a misunderstanding with, not sort of seeing he has a fundamentally incompatible worldview with the United States, was Joe Biden. And that is probably solely a function of the fact that he was in the room during the Obama administration and was able to see firsthand that Putin simply isn't a trustworthy actor, and that Putin's geopolitical objectives are to dominate Europe and to really impose a sort of Russian-centric rule on at least Central and possibly Western Europe.
Paul, what is upsetting me really so much, our European allies, it feels like there are a lot of adults in the room, but they're acting like kids. And, they always kind of are reacting too little too late. Don't you have that impression?
Yeah, so the Europeans, they have their hands tied, unfortunately, by really decades of underinvestment in their national security infrastructure. For context, when an earlier iteration of potential ceasefire peace deals were discussed, there was mention of European peacekeepers. But when each individual European country sort of got together, they realized they would be unable to field 20,000 peacekeepers on a sustained basis. That's across the entire European continent, right? 200 plus million people, and collectively an economy as large as China's, or nearly as large as China's. So that reflects just how poorly equipped the Europeans are to mount any kind of military resistance to, again, the Russian military, which, while Russia's economy is much smaller, they've raised a very large army. They have onshored a lot of their military manufacturing. They have a very robust partner in China. And so the Europeans, I think, are now turning around and saying, oh, since the Cold War, we depended on the United States to provide us with top tier level weapons, to provide us with essentially a backstop of national security issues, right? Any European national security threat, they could count on the U.S., the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force to deal with that. And so I think the Europeans are realizing that they are now sort of confronting this large Russian threat to their east, of 600,000 plus armed soldiers with the most modern equipment, right? Something like 1 to 2 million drones a year is what they're producing now. And the Europeans realize that they can't help. There's not much help they have to give.
Paul, you as a person who's observing the situation, the Russian war in Ukraine very closely, you know a lot. And your video is always helping me a lot to understand something that I don't understand from, different perspective. And one of the latest video you posted, it was about the Russian air defense, not Ukrainian one. And you were trying to explain that it's not that strong against Ukrainian drones. Why?
Well, I think what is historically a major Russian geopolitical advantage is become kind of a liability, which is Russia's huge size. In some ways, Ukraine, because it's a smaller country, I think can actually its air defenses can be much more robust, right? There's fewer sort of air corridors that you can see drones enter Ukrainian airspace. In contrast, Russia has to safeguard an unbelievable array of potential targets spread out over thousands and thousands of square kilometers. And so they have to either use their very limited air defenses to, one, either prioritize frontline locations, military installations, but that leaves some of their oil infrastructure more vulnerable. So I think what you're seeing more and more is that Russian air defenses are unable to be mobile in the ways that even the Ukrainians can, right? Shifting from location to location over a few hours. For Russia to move an air defense system from one oil refinery to another would take days. And so I think this, combined with the fact that potentially sanctions on highly sophisticated equipment like radars might actually be starting to bite and leaving Russia with less sophisticated air defenses everywhere, I think is really working to Ukraine's advantage in terms of the strategic drone balance of power.
Yeah, you're right. I've heard that the most well-protected cities in Russia, two, Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is, quite logical. But what about occupied Crimea?
So I can't speak to the specifics of what Russia has deployed. From what I've heard, it actually changes very frequently. They're often moving and redeploying. But Ukraine has had still considerable success striking targets in Crimea. Even some of the Western-provided missile systems are able to hit targets within Crimea. And so reportedly, Russia has increasingly had to sort of move their military equipment further and further away. But I think they, even to whatever extent they can shore up Crimea, doing so comes at a cost of other targets, particularly these energy infrastructure, refineries, and some reports indicate that Russia's oil refining capacity is down by as much as 10%, which, given that Russian oil exports overall are down as well, that is actually a pretty rough constraint for an already stretched thin Russian economy.
Absolutely. That's a main source for Russian war in Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, that's the main source for them of money.
Mm-hmm. Right. And money, because Russian mobilization is not a draft, it's not conscription, it's voluntary. And that those volunteers need increasingly large payouts to sign on. And so when you combine that, the fact that increasing amounts of the Russian war material is imported, purchased from China, the ability to damage Russia's fundraising, right, either oil sales, really has significant ripple effects. And again, there's increasing stories about the major Russian banks finding themselves having to loan Russian companies increasingly large sums of money that they're unable to pay back. Even the Russian central bank is starting to acknowledge that the civilian economy in Russia is really starting to fall apart. And so I think there's a larger fiscal crisis looming in Russia. And I'm not even sure that Vladimir Putin is necessarily fully aware of it because of how secretive the Russian state has been about the real state of its economy.
Paul, Russia just maybe a week ago has canceled its self-imposed ban on deploying intermediate-range missiles. And it was like days after Trump ordered 2 more U.S. nuclear submarines into global patrol. Is that a real message for the world? Maybe it's, I don't know, people saying it's probably because of the possibility using Oreshnik against Ukrainian cities.
Yeah, it's tough to discern. I mean, the Russians have not been complying with the letter of the treaty for some time. So I think officially withdrawing from the treaty is probably symbolic, as is Trump's reposition of nuclear submarines. The U.S. ballistic missile submarine force is always at the ready, always around the clock. We have submarines at various locations around the globe, ready to respond to a strategic nuclear threat. That's intrinsic to how mutually assured destruction works. So I think it's a little bit performative, at least right now. Obviously, if new information were to come out, that would be different. But again, we've seen Russia deploy the Oreshnik once before. So again, the treaty has not been respected by Russia. And so I think now it's just a trade-off of sort of symbolic threats.
Yeah, they love it, these symbolic threats. Paul, haven't you thinking that why, after more than 3 years of a full-scale invasion and enormous losses of Russian army on the battlefield, we still have not seen any resistance in the Russian army?
Yeah, that's difficult to say. I think some of it is the fact that these are mobilized volunteers, and in some ways, the mask is off for these Russians. I think, based on simply the number of casualties, it is no secret to anyone who signs up that they are signing up for a one-way trip. And I think that the money is so great, and that a lot of these Russians sort of have this nihilistic worldview of like, I'm signing up, my family will get a large sum of money, and I won't be returning. And so I almost think that signaling is helping keep the Russian army functioning, because again, highly skilled soldiers are seem to be incurring fewer casualties. The Russian tactics push all of the risk onto these low-skilled infantry soldiers that conduct these kind of assault operations. And I think that is basically the reason that the Russian military continues to operate, because the risk is onto the people who end up understanding that the risk they're signing on for is tremendous.
Sorry, it wasn't okay, but I was laughing from this one-way ticket. Yeah, I was watching. I watched some blogs, Russian blogs, and it's becoming very popular there for Russian women to marry Russian soldiers. Not like it was 20 years ago when they had, they will become a general, they will have a salary and etc. No, because he's gonna die and she will get the money. And it tells a lot about the Russian society in itself, And for the end, I wanted to ask you a question. We, in our Ukrainian society, we are not talking enough, what I think, about the ending this war. We see only two options: winning or losing, or a temporary ceasefire, 60 days, 1 year, and maybe some ceasefire in the air. But what do you think? Because people think that if the World War II ended as it ended, that's the whole wars in the world was ending like that, which is not true. It's just because of maybe lack of knowledge. People don't know that not every war ending like strictly, you are losing, we are winning, and that's it, period. So what is your vision of the ending this war, the best case scenario, and the worst one?
Sure. So, I think the least interesting are the best and worst case scenarios, which I'm sure is in everybody's mind, right? Yeah. Winning or losing. But I think that it's very true that historically there are a wide range of ways that wars conclude. What I think is most indicative might be the Korean War, right? That was fought in the 50s, and it actually only has ever been a ceasefire. There's never been a durable, sustained peace treaty between the two sides, but they simply agreed to stop fighting along a designated front line. That front line had been largely static for 3 to 4 years, and that front line basically just became mined and militarized and one of the most, heavily armed borders in the world. But the result was that the North Korean aggressor, remained intact as a state, but South Korea remained a free representative government. And so if I had to put money on an outcome, I think that seems like one of the most likely, in which there is sort of a de facto agreement of fighting stopping, and it would require a sufficiently strong defensive line or defensive technologies that resuming fighting would be seen as too costly for either side. And as we've seen with South Korea, right, once they were able to achieve, now they had the backing of the United States and the UN in a much more on the ground way. Literally, U.S. troops were fighting that war. But once that ceasefire was intact, the relationship between the South Koreans, the United States, the Japanese, it became very strong. And really, if you look at the South Korea in 1950 at the end of the war, in 1959, to the South Korea today, you see that they have had a massive amount of economic growth. So I think if I were a betting man, that some version of a freezing of the front lines, a promise to try to negotiate a peace deal, but ultimately just kind of a recognition that neither side acknowledging that the war is over, but a recognition that further territorial conquest is unlikely. But again, it's hard to predict any of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paul, for your time. And we'll see what's going to happen next Friday in, no, it's not next, it's this Friday, sorry. This Friday in Alaska, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic as you are, so, but at least, I don't know, maybe some surprise will come up, a good one for Ukraine.
Right. And, it's like the weather. The nice thing about Trump's lack of a policy is that if he announces a policy you don't like, just wait a couple days. He'll change his mind.